Ahead of Modi government 2.0's first budget, a lot of questions arise in an economist's mind. Will she take care of jobs? Will she take care of growth? Will she be able to walk the tightrope of fiscal prudence? To understand this and more, we talk to Shubhada Rao, Chief Economist, Yes Bank.
I think the new government, the re-elected government, has come in at a time where on one side the major macroeconomic parameters seem to be well under control, namely the inflation, the external sector, and therefore the interest rate environment. However, I think the key challenges in the very near term for the government are to address the growth slowdown, which seems to have picked up momentum over the last 2 quarters, particularly from the side of consumption. We have not really seen, in addition, any meaningful pickup in the investment from the private sector. So far, the government has been, controlling or rather spearheading the investment recovery. But given the relatively limited fiscal headroom at this point in time, there may not be an unlimited recourse with the government to continue to pump prime and also reinvigorate investment environment. So 3 factors that I would say that the government needs to work on ASAP are: 1, reviving consumption, reinvigorating investment, and most importantly, I think nurturing the financial sector back to health. I think unless and until we address the last one first, financing of growth will become a little bit of a challenge, and therefore all 3 have to be paid equal attention to in the forthcoming budget steps, budget measures. I think, as I said, there's a limited headroom now available because the challenges and the spending demands are many, whereas in a scenario where growth has remained relatively sideways in terms of a 6.8 to 7%, the tax collections cannot be alone looked at for the revenue garnering. The government will need to look at more sources of revenue in the current year's budget making, namely the 5G spectrum, which could be rolled out in a phased manner. There is also a chatter about the timing of the surplus, based on the ECF of Jalan Committee report findings or the recommendations. So probably some quantum of money could come in from there. GST seems to be stabilizing the tax collections under GST. So there will need to be, and in addition, the disinvestment revenues. So these should begin to take care of some of the revenue side challenges. On the expenditure, as we said, the focus has to be the rural economy, the farm economy, as also on the government enterprises side, reinvigorating the investment cycle. So given these kind of revenue vis-a-vis expenditure demands, I would think it would be prudent on the part of the government not to overextend itself or not to loosen up its FRBM path, because we do need global capital to come in to fund the growth, and we may not have too much of leeway in overextending ourselves as far as the fiscal ratios are concerned. So fiscal consolidation needs to be adhered to. An expenditure switch is what we are looking at, focus on rural economy and so on. I think that in turn should hopefully keep the government on the path of fiscal discipline. I think we need to put the sector, which is the MSME sector, back on track very quickly. On the back of demonetization and subsequently on GST, I think the sector that really needs fair amount of hand holding to get back to a normalization path is the micro and small medium enterprises. They are labor intensive, they are export intensive. I think job creation needs to get done there. In addition to creating enabling conditions for growth for MSME, etc., I think very important part that the government needs to focus on is the imparting of skills and reskilling. Here we believe that it's not just the onus of the government, but equally important is the onus of the private sector, namely the manufacturing sector, where we believe dispensations like industry associations can play a lead role, because they are the ones who know where are the skilling gaps, what is the gap between the demand and supply of labor, and if they equally share and shoulder the burden of skilling the labor force that is currently on rolls and potentially going to be on rolls, if both government and private sector join hands in this particular very critical function, I think job creation would not be that difficult over the next couple of years. I think the feel-good or the well-being budget, so we speak, is something that pleases all. As I said, consumption needs to get a leg up, continues to receive focus. Some measures that the government can consider doing are reviewing some of the GST rates, particularly say auto sector. That has been languishing for quite a few quarters now. So if some GST rates could be looked at there in terms of lowering of those rates, in terms of direct tax, if more money can be put into the hands of people for consumption, so you are basically addressing some of the concerns of the middle class earners who pay taxes, and if that burden of taxation can somewhat get addressed, you are putting more money into the hands of people. Read it as raising the scope of personal disposable incomes. That would create a well-being. And when I say direct taxes, it's not just the personal income tax, I'm also talking of the corporate tax. So if we see some kind of rationalizing of the taxation rates as well as the segments that we tax, probably it could induce some kind of positive sentiment at least. And more importantly, I think you need to address the sectors that are currently undergoing some form of the stress or the other. You have the NBFCs. As I said, financial sector needs to get nurtured back to health. You need to put liquidity into the hands of NBFCs, particularly the NBFCs which are undergoing a serious liquidity kind of mismatch. We also need to address specifically automotive sector. We need to resolve the telecom sector, the aviation sector. So there are specific steps that the budget could consider addressing. Mind you, in many of the sectors, it's not all pervasive problem. It is probably one or two players kind of a problem. But unless and until we start addressing those and create a positive sentiment around each of these sectors, I think that would define it as a budget which gives a positive vibe or a well-being and so on and so forth. I think we have been talking about 3 or 4 reforms which need to be taken up, particularly in the early phase of the government's tenure, which is now to next year. I think land and labor reforms. Admittedly, these fall under the state governments, but the central government needs to initiate and direct the labor reforms kind of environment, which basically allows the firms to have flexibility in rules, induces the firms to grow and not just restrict themselves to small size because of the caveats put in some of the labor laws. Land, I think the government needs to create land banks more extensively, not just for infrastructure, but also for private sector to come in and set up facilities. So land, labor reforms, agriculture sector reforms, I think those have been the ones which have been needing attention for a long period of time. We need to review the economic size of holding of the agriculture land on a average ticket size. We need to bring in scale. We need to bring in private sector investment in agriculture, bring in the infrastructure of agriculture relating to moving the whole agri activities up the value chain, so that there is a job creation also parallelly that is taken care of. I think there are multiple demands that one would have, or a wish list is pretty long, but it would be perhaps pertinent at this point for the government to segregate the next 100 days agenda and the next 365 days agenda, because we always believe that the first 2 years of the government are the most productive in terms of the appetite for reforms, and that is where the government needs to seize this opportunity ASAP.